Welcome, everybody. We are so excited to have you in class today. Today's class is a very special class. We call it a Ken Burns takeover class. And this amazing class is here for everybody to learn together. My name is Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And I will be with you in the chat where we encourage you to ask questions throughout the class, and we'll weave those questions in to our great professors here to teach us today. But we're going to talk a lot about Ben Franklin. And let me tell you the lineup of amazing people we have. Number one, Professor Dunbar at Rutgers University is going to be here to talk to us about history, Ben Franklin, and the work that she did with the amazing filmmaker Ken Burns, whose documentary on Benjamin Franklin comes out on April 4th and 5th at 8 p.m. at night. So students, don't worry. You can also watch it on pbs.org if that's a little too late for you. But it's really an amazing way that we can talk about our history, our past, and probably the most well-known American of all time. Now, to lead this conversation with us is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, Jeff Rosen. So without further ado, Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Curry, and welcome Ken Burns and Erica Dunbar. It is such an honor to welcome you both. Ken Burns, it's always so meaningful for the Constitution Center whenever you grace us with your presence. Your light and learning about constitutional history inspires all of us to learn more and to be our best self. And Erica Dunbar, your path-breaking work on American history is similarly inspiring, and your insights about Franklin, I just can't wait to hear them. Right before we started, I confessed that I have a bust of Ben Franklin above my fireplace, and I took it down to inspire us. And Ken, you said that you also have a bust of Franklin, along with busts of some of the other great historical figures you've written about. But I'll start off by asking the central but obvious question: why did you choose to make a documentary about Franklin, and what about him inspires you?
Well, I think he chose me. You know, I'm interested in how my country works. And I've told you this before, Jeff, that every film we make we're making the same film. And it's asking a very simple question: who are we? Who are those strange and complicated people that like to call themselves Americans? And what does an investigation of the past tell us about not only where we've been, but where we are now and where we may be going? And in the life and times and work and flaws of Benjamin Franklin is us, all of us. And it's such an instructive sort of output from one human being that would have such an outsized effect on who we are now today. And I was so happy to be able to work with Professor Dunbar because she helped us sort of broaden the number of perspectives and how to see Benjamin Franklin, not just with his obvious failings, but in other ways of understanding the very complicated story of this guy. So I just think he's great. He offers us a window into our founding that feels like we can know who these people are. Some of us, you know, who aren't necessarily into history or have a hard time, particularly in that period, getting past the breeches and the waistcoats and the powdered wigs and the S's that look like F's and all of that stuff. And yet Franklin is there dealing with the same stuff we're dealing with now. And that makes him super interesting. And because he was always super interested in everything, then there's a kind of bubbling up enthusiasm. Just at that moment when the pot begins to boil, you sort of feel like, oh, that's Franklin, you know, because an experiment is about to happen, or an idea is going to come, or a good compromise is going to be made. That's Benjamin Franklin. So he's irresistible.
A bubbling up enthusiasm. What a wonderful way to put it, of experiments and compromises and learning and life. Erica Dunbar, in the wonderful documentary, you have a very striking sentence. You say Benjamin Franklin was emblematic of what America wanted to be, could be, should be. What did you mean by that, and what about Franklin inspires you?
Yeah, I think this builds on Ken's comments that in order for us to sort of understand our present, we have to think about our past. And I can think of no better person than Franklin to help us understand ourselves as Americans as runaways, as brilliant inventors, as a father, a husband, a traveler, a diplomat. He embodied so much at a moment in time where we didn't quite know what the United States of America would look like, what that was, what it meant, what early America looked like. And so by doing it through the lens of Franklin, we have this opportunity to explore so much of early America through his point of view. And I'll also have to say that he was a really funny guy. Like when we think about him on a personal level, when we think about the founders, and students who are listening right now, when you think about founders, you probably think statues or Franklin on the $100 bill or Washington on the $1 bill, that we sort of put them up on pedestals and don't think about who they were as humans. And I think one of the most important things about this film and about us understanding Franklin was that he was, in many ways, although brilliant, a regular guy, and in many ways relatable. And so when we're trying to understand this moment of the founding of the nation and the years leading up to it, to be able to do it with probably the most relatable founder, I think is fantastic, and also leads to really good storytelling. Yeah. And so I'm hoping people, students today, that you hang out with us and also imagine yourselves in early America, in 18th century America, and to try and do it through Franklin's point of view, but also give yourself the space to think about it through your own.
Wow, what a great way to put it. Husband, father, with a sense of humor, and the most relatable founder. And that is indeed an inspiring way to study history. Ken, I want to ask you about a part of Franklin's biography that we're all interested in, and that's his quest for moral perfection. When he was in his 20s, he said, around this age, I had arrived at the bold and arduous project of trying to arrive at moral perfection. And he draws up a list of 13 virtues based on his
first 12.
Exactly. And then he adds humility at the end, and imitates Socrates and Jesus. But it's such a central part of his biography, and it's not something we often think about. They're based on the classical virtues of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. Why was he so interested in self-improvement and achieving virtue? And what should we make of his conclusion that although I never achieved the perfection I'd been ambitious of obtaining, I was by the endeavor a better and happier man than I otherwise should have been if I'd not attempted.
Well, we can't really go into his DNA, can we, and sort of figure things out. But this is somebody who had very little formal education. So as H.W. Brands, a writer in our film, says, he didn't know what he didn't. And so he decided he had to know everything. And he immersed himself in books. He was an avid reader and was very interested in them. And I think came in contact with all of the classical ideas and also the bubbling up of what's happening with the Enlightenment all his life. And so he's a lifelong learner. But the key to your question, Jeff, is a way of understanding things that are in our two founding documents. In the Declaration, remember, we're in pursuit of happiness. The key word is pursuit. Happiness, by the way, did not mean the accumulation of things in a marketplace of objects. It meant lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. That's what they thought happiness meant. So Franklin is the epitome of happiness because he is always trying to improve himself. He's always looking inward at the same time he's looking outward with a magnificent curiosity. And then remember, the preamble to the document that you're building in your institution and your life is dedicated to says a more perfect union, as if everyone understood that perfection is actually impossible, but that we needed to tilt towards that in all things. And Franklin is that magnificent individual, deeply flawed in lots of ways, who is always trying to move towards perfection, who is in pursuit of that 18th century notion of what capital H happiness actually meant.
Ken, that is such an inspiring answer. I can't wait to talk more with you about this. I'm writing a book now about how the founders understood the pursuit of happiness, and you're absolutely right and put it so well. that it was this classical idea of leading the good life, of being your best self, of lifelong learning, of eudaimonia. It turns out, I'm eager to share this with you. Jefferson also read the same passage from Cicero that Franklin read, and Jefferson made his own list of 12 virtues.
Yes. I made a film on Jefferson in the 90s, and Adams, who makes appearances in both of those films and other films, said, and I'll get this wrong, you probably know the quote perfectly, Jeff. He says, I study war and politics so that my children can study commerce and industry, so that my grandchildren can study music and the arts. So the logical progression is let us shed from our ordinary lives the things that human beings have been doing for centuries, right? War and politics. Let us build things, let us make things, and then let us be refined. And that is the pursuit of happiness right in that generational arc. And so these people, however deeply flawed they were and however flawed the documents they left us were, they're expansive enough, they're elastic enough to be able for everyone to now claim some ownership, stake their flag in one corner of that piece of paper, or 4 pieces of paper and amendments, and say, I own this too. And that's what's so great about Franklin, because he, of all the founders, has the most forward-looking gaze. That when you meet the young tradesmen that his estate set up in Boston and Philadelphia, they remind you of that hungry gleam in his eye of someone moving towards where she wants to go, right? And that's hugely inspiring.
So beautifully put. Erica, it's natural for me to ask you this urgently important question. How did Franklin do in living up to his virtues? He had a very arduous project, as he said, where you're supposed to make a list every night before you go to bed of how you fared and put an X next to the virtues where you've fallen short. And I tried this system once with a friend, and it's very daunting because you've got a lot of black marks every night. And Franklin said that's why he gave it up. But the virtues are temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, and so forth. We're having this very important debate in this country right now about whether or not the founders were virtuous, how they lived up to their own ideals. Just taking Franklin as a specific example, how did he do in living up to his own virtues?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I bet that everyone listening who knows a little bit about Franklin probably has a different opinion about how he held up to his own sort of tasks at hand, to his own will. And I think that Franklin understood that he was a work in progress, just as was the Constitution or the Declaration, as Kenneth just sort of said, sort of laid the bedrock for what generations would build upon in terms of creating a better union, right? Eventually a more perfect union. In terms of his personal life, I bet if asked, he probably would have not given himself the highest of marks. I think that if we look at him as a diplomat, as an educator, as an inventor, all of those kind of areas, he's getting pretty high marks. I think he's at the top of the class, and everyone, all of his peers, as well as his sort of junior colleagues, meaning the other founders, because Ben Franklin's one of the oldest ones, right? They all understand that. They understand the wisdom that comes with age, with experience, with his vast travels in Europe, that all of these things gave Ben Franklin a viewpoint, a lens through which to think about the present, but also he was invested in thinking about the future, right? And what he helped to create, how that would advance civilization, not just in what would become the United States, but around the world with all of his inventions. And so, I think we all know that we've got, that we don't measure up. And I think Franklin, to be very honest, measured up in most of all of his sort of professional his professional journey. But he had trappings. Maybe we'll have some time to talk about this. I think it's really important when we talk about it with students, because even Ben Franklin was flawed, right? Even Ben Franklin made bad decisions. Even Ben Franklin spoke out of turn, or perhaps handled a situation in a way that wasn't best. Yet he's still Ben Franklin. And I think there's a lesson from that, right? That we can't boil ourselves down to one bad decision, one mistake, or multiple mistakes, that we have to look at the body of work of an individual. And when we step back and look at the body of Franklin's work, everything he's done, I'm not sure that there's anyone who can really compete.
Nobody.
Wow, that's such a judicious, wise, and charitable answer. And Franklin talked in his autobiography about the spirit of charity and humility. And he said, even in the imperfect state, he was able to acquire the virtues he owed to the evenness of temper, and that cheerfulness in conversation, which makes his company still sought for and agreeable even to his younger acquaintances, the happiness that he was able to achieve in his life. So I really think that you've taught us a lot about viewing someone whole and recognizing that despite their private failings, the whole of their character is crucial for judging them. All right, Ken, I think it's time for me to ask you to introduce the first clip about the junta, where he tried to pursue this virtue project. Tell us about it.
So, this is, it really needs no introduction, but this omnivorous curiosity that we've been discovering, this idea of learning all the time, is with him from the very beginning. As a young school person in Boston, as an indentured servant, one step short of an enslaved person, to his brother's printing press. Thank God it was a printing press. And he's learning all the time. And so when he arrives in Philadelphia, a much more tolerant and open city, and he begins to continue his craft of print, of being a printer, he joins with sort of like-minded, it was called the Leather Apron Club, right? People who went to work and used their hands and yet weren't willing to be consigned to some sort of lower caste. They didn't want to be elitists, but they thought that they could think the thoughts of elitists. And so that is to say that they could ponder the central questions and maybe do it better than the elitists did. And so they were very much about raising themselves up educationally. So let's just look at this clip. There's some asterisks in this, of course, right? There's always in American history, there are asterisks. So let's just go in good faith into what Franklin's doing and see how this resolves.
He always looked around wherever he was and said, what needs to be done? What's missing? What are the things that a community ought to have? He had read enough to know that there was more elsewhere, and he wanted to make those good things happen to the community of Philadelphia.
Self-reliance, which Franklin loved, and community engagement may seem like they oppose each other. But as Franklin repeatedly said, the good that we can do together surpasses the good we can do alone.
Over the coming years, Franklin and his junto would turn to other civic projects to improve life in Philadelphia. Under their guidance, the city formed volunteer fire companies. They advocated for a police force paid by a property tax. And at one junto meeting, Franklin raised the idea of starting a college. When the Public Academy of Philadelphia finally opened in 1751, Franklin would be elected president of the board. It was the first non-sectarian college in America and would later become the University of Pennsylvania. Expanding on the junto model, he proposed and organized the American Philosophical Society, whose members would be scientists and intellectuals from throughout the colonies, who could share ideas and scholarly papers by mail if they could not come to meetings in person. It would become the colony's first learned society. And to build a new hospital, he devised a plan that matched private donations with public funds, giving people, he said, an additional motive to give, since every man's donation would be doubled.
He always believed that if you just get a few good and interested men, always men, on any civic problem, you can solve it.
Ben Franklin is, I think, emblematic of what America wanted to be, should be, could be. The things that he spoke of, the things that he wrote about, often missing are other people, women, people of color in particular, enslaved men and women, never had the opportunities that a Ben Franklin had.
He always
Wow, Erica, that's such a powerful aspiration of Franklin, all that America can be, and a reminder that, as you said, African Americans, women, and others did not have the opportunities that he had. You've written such important books, and I'd love our students to read them, about the evolution of African American women in Philadelphia, in particular, from an enslaved status to freedom in the years before the Civil War. And that's your great book, A Fragile Freedom. You have a definitive and riveting book on Ona Judge, the runaway slave that President Washington relentlessly pursued. And you have a unique ability to tell the story of Benjamin Franklin's very important evolution from, let's call it, indifference to the status of enslaved people at best, to championing the education of Black people, to, at the end of his life, petitioning Congress for the abolition of slavery. Tell us about that evolution and what struck you about Franklin's journey.
Yeah, I think that when we look at our founders and we think about these documents that we've already talked about, that, or at least mentioned, the Declaration, the Constitution, important bedrock documents to the founding of this nation. We know, we teach this, and you all the students who are with us right now, you know this story. You know that the majority of people living on the landmass that we now call the United States of America were not necessarily considered in this document or these documents. When we think about the pursuit of happiness as referenced with the Declaration, or the opportunity for a more perfect union, women, Black people, definitely Indigenous, First Nations people were not a part of that idea, right? But what's interesting is that Ben Franklin understood at the moment in which these documents were being written that there was a fundamental problem already. He understood that. He knew that. He had spent time, although we know that Franklin was indeed a slaveholder. He purchased and sold enslaved people. We know this. This is a part of his life, and we as learners have to accept that, grapple with it, and understand that it sits side by side with the understanding that he also did some fantastic and motivational, aspirational things during his lifetime. But what we see with Franklin, in a way that we don't see it with the other founders, and a part of this is because of his age, is change over time with his feelings about enslavement in particular. And while he held on to slaves in the earlier years of his life, and we can't discount that, towards the end of his life, he landed at a very different spot. He was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. He was publicly making a stance about the detriment of enslavement, how not only was it cruel, inhumane, and tortured the lives of enslaved people, but also that it was a detriment to the lives of enslavers, of those who, and those who were not invested one way or another. And so we have a Franklin at the end of his life, the late 1780s, who is a very different person than the man we know in, say, the 1730s, right, or the 1740s. And I think that gives us an opportunity once again to see him as a man, as someone who changed ideas, feelings, motivations, but also to recognize that we as individuals can change as well. And it gives us this feeling, this understanding that we are not fixed, that who you are, if you're in fourth grade right now, who you are, what you think as a fourth grader, that's going to be radically different by the time you're in sixth grade or by the time you're finishing high school, that you will be a different person with different ideas. And we see that with Franklin.
What a powerful way to put his evolution. The fact that he was able to change his mind, to doubt his conclusions, it relates to your very judicious and charitable evaluation of his whole character. And it centrally relates to his most important speech at the Constitutional Convention, where he said, "The older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others." It was amazing to find the proposed Constitution approaching so near perfection as it does. Ken, you mentioned it. Originally, he had 12 virtues. He added the 13th, humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. To what degree was that effort to achieve humility, to doubt his own premises, central to his ability to change his mind about enslavement and other things, and to serve as a conciliator and mediator at the Constitutional Convention and throughout his diplomatic career?
Jeff, I can't say it any better than Erica or you just did. That's exactly what is happening. Of all the founding fathers, he's the one that's accessible because he is malleable. That is to say, Washington seems fixed. Jefferson seems fixed. Adams seems fixed. Madison seems fixed. And so what you have at the Constitutional Convention are all these people, as he put it, people with who bring their expertise and their genius and their prejudices all together, and that they've got to figure out some way to accommodate that. And it's his age. His son is older than John Adams. His son is older than Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Patrick Henry. So you've got somebody who is not only the best known American on the earth for his scientific advancements and his inventions, but he's somebody who can actually begin to understand, going back to the junto, which is Latin for to join. And these tradesmen and these craftsmen, these printers and carpenters and masons, they understand a kind of fundamental building block, literally and figuratively, of our civil and civic society. And that is a good connection, a good joint. That is to say, he himself would say, if you sand a little bit off this and sand a little bit off that, we can make a joint that lasts for centuries. And so that's at the heart of Franklin's. How are we going to achieve that? Now, we do know that part of compromise, particularly on moral issues like enslavement of other people, is a dangerous territory. But there's not going to be a United States of America, if you want it, right, without that. And he kind of understands that and has already, I think Erica would agree, by the time he's forging compromises, including the 3/5 of America. That is to say, the South isn't going to join this effort at a United States unless their representation is falsely buoyed by the number of enslaved people they have. So that gives them an unnatural legislative advantage, even though those people who are being counted as only 3/5 of a person have zero rights, as do most of the people on the continent, not just the enslaved people, not just the indigenous people, but the majority of the human beings, the white people that are also there, because they're women, right? So you've got a lot of work to do in all of this. And there is a kind of, I think, a glorious vagueness to the poetry of all these documents. I mean, the Constitution, the preamble's poetry, but everything else is mechanics. It's like what you do when your car breaks down on the road. You open the glove compartment and you get out the manual, right? So it's just nuts and bolts. Nobody's worried about how well you're writing it. It's like how you actually fix this thing or understand how it works. It's an operating manual. The Declaration of Independence is mostly complaints. It's got poetry at the beginning and poetry at the end. And can I just tell you what the king did to us? And the interesting thing is that the language they use, particularly the Southern plantation owners, the language they use is that the king has put us into a kind of slavery. And you go, excuse me? And so right at our founding, and Franklin's right at the fulcrum of the decisions, he gets that. There's a big excuse me. Yeah. And that is what many of the scholars in our film, including Erica, referred to this. We just did an event like this with Condoleezza Rice and Nicholas Burns, no relation, a State Department, our now ambassador to China, but a lifelong State Department employee, talking about Benjamin Franklin and diplomacy. And she said, rather than say original sin, as we almost all do, she says, I prefer birth defect. That we were born with a birth defect.
And can I just jump in quickly and say that, I think it's important to note that Franklin does more than, when we're talking more specifically about this defect of slavery. Although, there's a part of me that bristles a little bit about this notion of a birth defect, because it's something that you're born with, that's inherited, when we know that there were laws that forced and created people who were of African descent to be enslaved, right? So there's a part of me that says, I have to think about that.
And it's not a sin. It's not a sin either, because that seems to come on from on high. It's just we screwed up. It's not
exactly.
Right.
It's a problem. Right. It's not right. It's a problem. And the point I wanted to make was that Franklin was uncomfortable with the compromise that had to sort of happen with the creation of the Constitution. But I think what's important is not to just focus on Franklin's change of mind or his feelings about enslavement in particular, but his actions.
Yes.
Right. So yes, he's a part of this compromise of the Constitution that says we're only counting Black people as 3/5 of a human. Okay, big oops, right? Big problem. But then you step back and you see what else Franklin's doing. Right. And Franklin's not allowing runaway advertisements for enslaved people in his newspaper, in the Pennsylvania Gazette. He's basically charged with the presidency of one of the major abolitionist societies in the nation. He is pushing the needle in the places where he can, but also understands the roadblocks and impediments that he had to actually yield to. And I think to him, it was something that made him regretful, and he had to, in the spaces that he could, move the needle.
This is the key, Jeff, because I'd like to, and guilty, as you'll see in the clip, of promoting original sin, and I agree that birth defect doesn't really travel very well more than a couple of sentences. It's a mistake, and this old printer understood that you had the ability to admit your mistakes and print what is called an errata. It is a declaration that I made a mistake. And he spent his entire life having realized all of the failings that he had in all of those virtues, the way in which none of us succeed. None of us are perfect. He had this ability to understand, and he was had a sense that there was a scale, and having, done the bad side, he had to equal it. And so you see in his actions, this old printer printing his mistakes and saying, I made a mistake here. It shouldn't have been this. It should have been that. And that's the key to everything. It's the key to going forward. It's the key to teaching history. It's the key to understanding our present moment. It's a key to anticipating and inspiring to a better future. All of that is in the space in which we permit ourselves and also others to make mistakes and to be imperfect. And Franklin is all over that in a generous way. And I think, part of what's so good about that Constitution, is him. For all of those tragic compromises, as Erica's suggesting, there's a lot of really good stuff. That manual, it's just 4 pieces of parchment written at the end of the 18th century that's able to adjudicate, almost all of our problems in the 21st century.
Wow, this is such a remarkable conversation. You're both teaching us so much. Ken, you started off by teaching us about that meaning of the word junto, which I now know how to produce, to join. And I think of the Franklin meme that went viral, as Professor Akil Amar told us a few classes ago, unite or die, join or die.
Join or die.
Join or die is the motto that just go.
He's the first person that understands what it is to be an American.
Yes.
He's borrowing, ironically, from the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederation's idea of how they solve their extra nation, extra tribal issues, right? So he's saying we're 13 disparate things, but can't we all get together? And he draws a snake, segmented, cut up, showing the different states. And he says, join or die. And this is decades before the revolution. Everybody's like, this is too radical. But what gets adopted when the revolution happens? It's Franklin's old thing. This is the beginning of unum. Right? This is what we're interested in. How, yes, what I want is important. That's the American idea of freedom that is selfish. But what we need is the American idea of civic. And let's remember, as I said last night with boring Erica to death, is that he was born in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that would become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he died in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And that it is key to understanding not just Benjamin Franklin, but us, both lowercase and the US, to get the idea of Commonwealth as an ingredient. And he would come to today and say, like Rodney King, why can't you all just get along? What's wrong with you? You can do this. We know how to do this.
Just amazing. And both of you emphasized, Erica's word is so important. This was a mistake, the original sin of slavery, but he was willing to admit mistakes. I think of learned Ham, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that's not too sure it is right. And
Yes.
That's the point of Franklin's final speech, where he says, and Erica, I'd love your reactions to this. He says, on the whole, sir, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of this convention who may still have objections to it would with me on this occasion doubt a little of his own infallibility,
Right.
and to make manifest our unanimity. Erica, was he right to make that appeal, and were the delegates correct to sign despite the manifest fallibilities that they accepted?
I mean, I think that's Franklin, begging for an apology. He's basically apologizing, right? He's saying, I know that this is flawed. I know this is problematic. And we're going to have to wrestle with that. And in his mind, he probably knew that it would at some point have to be revised, amended in places. But he also knew that would happen with a later generation, right? He knew where he was in his stage of life, right? And that at the moment, the most critical thing was to bring this union together, was to create the infrastructure for a new nation, one that came into being under every kind of duress and that no one ever thought would actually really happen. And so at that moment, he knew he had to sort of throw some things away in order to compromise. And when we think about compromise for the students who are here today, and you'll think about the compromise of 1850, you'll think about sort of moments when we have to make compromises that are uncomfortable, but for a larger project. And at that moment, Franklin understood, what do we say now? He understood the assignment, right? Our students he understood the assignment. The assignment was to create this document, to create this union, this republic, which was revolutionary unto itself, right? And in order to do that, there were some things that were left on the cutting room floor that left him unhappy, but that was not the assignment. And so he did his job and left it to us. We're still dealing with this, right? Yeah. He left it to us and future generations to perfect what he obviously noted was an imperfect document.
Wow. So powerfully put. Ken, I think it's time to you'd introduce the second clip.
Yeah, well, we're just parachuting right in to where we want to be here. We're in the middle of the Constitutional Convention. We've basically sidestepped the question of slavery, and let's drop in there very, very briefly to see what those compromises wrought.
For Franklin, unity and compromise was the only thing that could make this new nation move forward. Without it, it would be a failed journey. American democracy would not develop without it. And for that reason, Franklin, as well as others, sidestepped the issue of slavery.
On September 17th, 1787, the delegates gathered to vote on the proposed Constitution. Benjamin Franklin made the motion for its adoption.
I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. I doubt, too, whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly, can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. And I think it will astonish our enemies, who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded, like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus, I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best.
Franklin's motion was approved. One by one, the delegates signed the new Constitution so it could be sent to the states for ratification.
He signed it, and I think he was relieved that it brought Americans together. And that was something that he had wanted ever since the Albany Conference. He had wanted Americans to be a part of one grand whole. This might not be the best, but it was the best that you could get, and he recognized that.
The Constitution is the framework for an ongoing argument about who we are as a people and where power resides. And it's presumed that each generation will be engaged in an argument and take it in new directions. What do we mean by we the people? And certainly we mean a lot more people now than we did then.
With the work done, the doors to Independence Hall were thrown open. Franklin was approached by one of the city's most prominent citizens, Elizabeth Willing Powell, whose own rights had not been considered. She asked him, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" "A republic," he answered, "if you can keep it."
A republic, if you can keep it. Which turns out to be maybe the most prophetic sentence of all. Everyone who cares about this country has to ask that question every day. A republic, if you can keep it.
Wow. Well, the Q&A is full of phenomenal questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Curry in a second. Just for some specifics, Robert Wong asked, which of the 13 virtues did Franklin say he had most trouble achieving? It was order. He said he wasn't very well organized.
That's what John Adams would agree, but I think it's still humility. I think it's still humility. A friend had to point out that he'd missed that.
That's an even more important one. Well, and there are so many others, including did he free his slaves? And of course he did. But I need to ask Ken, if I might, that quote from Mrs. Powell and Franklin's response, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it," has become a truism, a cliche, but it's also profoundly deep and meaningful. And I must ask you what you think, how Franklin thought we could keep it. And I think, if I can give you a hypothesis, it has to do with that idea of continuing to be lifelong learners and taking the time to listen to arguments on both sides and trying to achieve the perfection that he also tried to achieve but fell short of. But I want to know your answer. Because
I agree with that. I think it's three-legged. It's understanding that the compromises left us, as Erica said, and Joe Ellis just said, with work to do, right? And I think it's also the sense that now we throw it upon the students who are here.
Mm-hmm.
We say to you, I mean, he perceived, having understood the mechanics of this, how strong and yet how fragile it was. And it required a kind of combination of the determination and the gentleness necessary to understand that you might go a step forward and a step back, or 3 steps forward and 2 steps back at all times. But really right now, Jeff, and I think Erica would agree with me, we're looking to all of you. You have to become the protectors of the Constitution. You have to be the courageous people who write the errata that we're still not getting right. You have to go out and form the compromises, which at times may not feel as comfortable as just standing for whatever you believe, understanding, as Franklin did, that people are going to bring their wisdom, but their prejudices, and that you could maybe average them out a little bit. And remember that life isn't all about acquiring Benjamins. He would be the first to tell you that that's an okay thing to do well by yourself, but that we are honor bound to give it back to our communities in our civic engagement, in our insistence on civil discourse, speaking and listening to the other, in shaking hands with everyone once you leave, as Erica reminded us, a Quaker school. And just so that it's harder to be mad at someone you've shaken the hands of. So it's really on all of you to protect this very fragile thing, which has remarkably been going for the longest time. I mean, nobody else ever had a government like this until we invented it, with all its flaws. That speech that he gives for its adoption is so moving. It is so moving because our enemies were there saying, oh yeah, watch how long this lasts, right? That they'll be cutting each other's throats. And we did, over slavery, 75 years after the Declaration, that happened. But we didn't completely cut our throats, and we got through, and we still have tons of work to do. And it's not for Jeff or Ken or for Erica to do. It's you guys. You have to do it. You have to go on and keep what he wanted.
Wow, that was so moving. Try to be more perfect, fix the errata, and students insist on civil discourse, on speaking and listening, so that you can keep the republic and make a more perfect union. Erica, I have the same question to you, because that was so meaningful, and I'm so eager for your wisdom for the students. What's your advice to them about what Franklin can teach all of us about how they can keep the republic?
Yeah, I mean, Ken sort of, I think, said it so well. I'll simply add, in addition to protecting what the founders put in place, I'd say it's to protect and perfect as best as possible. Sort of understanding that will we ever have a sort of perfect anything when it comes to a nation as diverse and large? No, we won't. But I do think, I love the kind of charge that we've given to everyone who's tuned in today, that we're at stations in our lives where we're going to continue to tell stories and to make films and write books that help you all this kind of next generation of learners, of leaders, to think about the past in ways that help to inform your present and the future. So I would say Franklin was an inventor. He was a scientist. And what he always knew when we think about process is that the first kind of go at an invention usually didn't turn out so good, right? You know that you kind of, when you're in the laboratory or when you're writing a draft of a paper, you know you're going to have to do it more than once, right? In order to get to something that feels right. I won't say perfect, I'll say feels right. And I think we're still in that stage of development, right? Development in a film or in a book or in creating inventions that we're working on it. And now we're sort of passing the baton to you all to do your work and to lean on the sort of wisdom of those who come before, like a Franklin, like a Ken Burns, like others. But really, we're passing the baton, and we have great faith that you all have benefited. Also, when we think about so many folks, y'all are tuning in from school, many of you, you know, when Franklin was young, there was no such thing as public school. There weren't, you know, there was no sort of understanding that everyone is supposed to have some kind of education. No, but look where we are now. That's not to say that education is not problematic and that we've got to fix things with equity. But once again, you all are benefiting from some of the things that Franklin supported and pushed for most of his life. And so once again, this just goes back to the idea of protect and perfect.
So beautiful. Thank you for that, Professor Dunbar. Curry, do we have time for just one or two of the amazing questions that are filling up the chat box from our students?
We really quickly, because we are over time, but you all did an amazing job actually answering so many of the questions throughout the entire chat. And I love that protect and perfect, and it takes energy to keep things moving forward. Robin asked a question in the beginning, and it really begins with the conversation that we started with, that he was an inventor, a writer, a diplomat, signer of the Declaration, signer of the Constitution. The question that she asked is twofold. One, if he was to walk, come into the Wayback Machine, but go forward in time, and to come out of the National Constitution Center and look at Independence Hall, what would knock his socks off? And I love how Robin wrote that. What would just blow his mind?
Well,
Yeah, and then the other side of that is, what would he say? You haven't fixed this yet, and charges to do more. So for both of you,
the obvious thing is that he would look at our partisanship and go, boy, didn't you get anything that I said? Didn't you understand what all of us did? We all gave up a little bit in order to have that joint that would last a few hundred years. And by the way, it's a few hundred years. Why are you weakening this joint, right? But I'm on a promotion tour for this film, and one of the first reporters asked me, said, Franklin wouldn't understand social media. And I said, are you kidding me? He was social media, right? Exactly. He was social media. He was a printer. He was a publisher. He was a newspaper man. He was a postmaster. He was Apple. He was Google. He was Twitter and Facebook all at one. And there was funny stuff, and there were little things, and there was important and serious stuff. I mean, it's all there. He'd get it. He'd go, I think it would knock his socks off. He'd be sort of saying, oh, that's too bad that it's mostly used that way. But I think he would wonder and worry about the web. I think he might say, oh, from my observations in nature, a web is a place where you first get stuck, and then you get killed.
That's a good point for the World Wide Web at times too. So Professor Dunbar, knock his socks off and be nodding, like shaking his head at us.
Yeah, I'm also just thinking about, because everybody should know I'm a Philadelphian. So I'm thinking about the actual space of kind of Independence Hall and the way it has been preserved, the way it's been sort of built to memorialize the work that came out of that kind of founding era. I think he would be totally tickled and pleased by it, right? Because in many ways, when you take your bus trips to see the Liberty Bell and Constitution Hall and National Constitution Center, right? We understand this as sort of ground zero, right, for the building of this nation. And to travel there now, to be there in that space, to know the streets that he walked, the places that he lived and spent time in, and understand this as a kind of the sort of origins, part of the origin story of this nation. I think it would give him great delight. And I think he would also be delighted that we're careful to tell now stories of many people, not just when we think about the imagery that we see in the film. It's very representative of that moment, right? They're mostly white guys in those images. But now when you stand on the mall and you look at these buildings and you look at the institutions that are set up to celebrate Jewish life, and around the corner, the African American Museum, or even where George Washington's house originally stood, to understand and see the broadsides, if you will, of life of the enslaved, that he would know that the work that the founders did was important, and that it's been built upon, memorialized, and would expect, once again, these students who are with us today to expand that and to make it better.
Thank you so much. So that just made me even more prouder of my city. So thank you, unbelievably helpful. And as we lead to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in the city and the celebration around the Declaration and the Constitution, this is unbelievably amazing lessons that we're learning and will continue to engage with over time. I want to just thank you all so much. This was a fantastic conversation. You were just the best teachers we could have asked for. And the unbelievable taglines that you have taught us in this class that we will be able to use over and over again in our classrooms with our students, at the table, the kitchen table, the dining room table, and ways to have conversations about really ensuring that it's our job to keep going towards perfection. And that is what Franklin meant. And that is our charge from him to us. So thank you all so much for this great conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. Any final words, Jeff, to wrap us all home?
Well, I can't do better than Susan Economy, who says in the chat that both of you exemplify what you're pointing out about Franklin. To be a lifelong learner is a virtue, and for inspiring all of us to be lifelong learners. On behalf of the National Constitution Center, thank you both so much.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.